In this video, we're going to learn about default prop values. So we already know that our components, whether they're classes or functions, can get props passed into them. But what if a prop isn't passed in? We can actually go ahead and set up a default. To explore this, let's take a look at the header component down below. Right now, the header takes the title and the subtitle, and it renders both of them in an H1 and an H2 respectively. But what if we wanted to set up a default value for title so it didn't need to be provided if it was, for example, indecision, which it might be on many pages, but you could also override it if you passed in your own title. We can also set up the subtitle to not have a default. So if there is no subtitle, we could actually just remove the H2 altogether. We can add a little conditional rendering to get this done. So whether we have a class-based component or a function-based component, we can add on default prop values by tacking on a property after we define the component. Right here, it is going to be header dot, and this one is called default props. Now, default props is just an object, and on here, we can specify the various props that we want to give a default value to. In this case, we have title and subtitle, but we're only going to give a default to title, so we can set that up. Title, and in here, we will have some default showing to the screen. So now if we try to render header and we do not provide a title prop, some default is going to show up instead, and we can go ahead and prove that. Up above, what I'm going to do is remove the title prop from getting passed into header. I'm going to save the file, and we can see what happens over inside of the rendered output. Right here, some default does indeed show up. If I were to go ahead and undo those changes, bringing the title back, and I were to save the file, the default isn't going to get used because a valid prop was passed in. Now for our purposes, we might want to set this title to indecision by default, but we'll allow other pages to override the header title should they want to. This means that since we are on a page where we do want the title to be indecision, we can actually remove the title altogether, and we can even remove the variable up above. Now, as I mentioned, the subtitle is still something we're going to pass in. We're not going to set up a default for the subtitle, but we could actually go ahead and add a little bit of conditional rendering in here, only rendering the H2 when we actually have a subtitle. I can cut out the H2, adding it to the clipboard. I can set up my JavaScript expression. Right here, we're going to check props.subtitle. Now, if it is a truthy value, we'll use the logical AND operator, and then right here, I'll just paste in the JSX I cut out. Now, we should see the subtitle if it's provided, and it's going to go away if it's not provided. And the end result is a much more flexible header component. We can choose to pass in as many props as we want, but we can actually now pass in no props. We're not going to see a subtitle, but we will still get that default title, and right here, everything is working as expected. Now for our purposes, we can still pass the subtitle in, so I will undo that change. This is going to ensure we do see the subtitle, which we do want on this page. But if we didn't want a subtitle, we could just remove the prop, and the component is smart enough to know what to do. It's not just our functional components that can have default props. The same is true for our class-based components. For example, the indecision app component. With our class-based components, we can actually create some more interesting behavior. So indecision app currently doesn't take any props in, it uses them nowhere, but we could go ahead and set up the props to actually configure the default state values. So we could fall back to an empty array, but we could also allow the person rendering indecision app to pass some default options in, which can be a really useful pattern. It allows us to pass in data and configure indecision app, but it also allows us to change that data over time. If we were going to do that, we would probably set up a default options prop, which would be an empty array, and then we would allow them to override that with something of their own. So let's play around with that. I'm going to take indecision app, and all we're going to do is set up the default props object down below. Down here, indecision app, dot default props. Now we just mentioned that we're going to set up a single one. We're going to call this one options. And we're going to start it off as an empty array, exactly like what we currently have. And if we scroll up to the very top, we can now reference that right here. I can reference props dot, and in this case, we have options. Now, that's not going to get passed in. We haven't changed our react-dom.render call way at the bottom of the file, but the application is still going to work. It's going to fall back to that default, and right here you can see we have no items, which is great. We can go ahead and add some in, and they do show up to the screen. What we've enabled Indecision app to do, though, is to have the options passed down, a way to configure the default state. Down way at the bottom of the file, I'm going to go ahead and do just that. Right here, I'm going to set up options. I'm going to set it equal to inside of a JavaScript expression, some array, and we're just going to pass some options in. Option 1 and option 2. Now maybe we have a specific page where we want to pick between some bars, so I'll put some bars in my neighborhood. Let's do Devil's Den, and we'll do Second District. Now we have a way to pass some default values in, but also allow the user to customize the data. So if I save the application, I can see that Devil's Den and Second District are showing up. Since we do have data, we have the ability to pick right away. I pick and I see Devil's Den, but I also have the ability to add my own items. Let's say the bar I want to go to isn't here. I'll add in brew. Now that shows up, and I can always go ahead and remove everything, getting back to an empty array. So using default props is really powerful. It allows us to create really useful and reusable components, which in the end of the day is the goal. Now I'm going to go ahead and leave off options for now. We're going to start off with an empty array for the Indecision apps options state. But the ability to pass it in is something that we will be using in the future. Very useful feature. Now it's challenge time. Your challenge is going to be to do what we just did for Indecision app for counter. So we're going to allow counter to take a prop count. If that prop exists, we're going to use its value as the default state value. If it doesn't exist, you're going to set up a default value, set up default prop value to 0. So if the prop is passed in, great, we'll use that one as the starting state. If it's not, we'll default to 0, and we'll have the exact same functionality we're currently seeing. So take some time to knock that one out using the tools we just used, and then test your work. Make sure when you don't provide a prop value, we get 0, and make sure if you do pass a number in for count, we start at that number. Make sure to run the file through Babel as well, pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, that one shouldn't have been too bad. Step 1 is going to be to actually use the prop in the constructor. So right here, we're going to be setting up this new count prop. I'm going to start my state off at whatever its value is. Props.count. Now we actually need to set up a default. Otherwise, our application is going to fail. It's not getting passed in. So we're going to make sure that we always fall back to a valid number, which will be 0. So right here, we will set up counter.default props. We're going to go ahead and start this off at 0. So on our object, we'll provide the 1 prop. We actually want to set a default for count, and we'll start it at 0. Now, if we save the file and run the program through Babel, we should see the counter app working as it was before. I'm going to shut down Babel for the app file, and we're going to switch it up to run the file inside of the playground folder. That is the counter example file. Counter example.js. When I run the file over inside of the browser, I should see the count starting at 0, and that is exactly what we get. If I were to switch up the default to 100, we would start at 100. So by default, if no prop value is passed in, the default gets used. Now we're going to stick with 0 as the default, but we also now have the ability to pass in a count. So to wrap this up, I'm going to test that that works as well. I'm going to set count equal to, and right here, we will start things off at -10. If I save counter example, what do we get? We get -10 showing up. I can add, I can remove from -10, I can reset to go back to 0. Everything is working as expected, and it's working because we have default props set up. That means we can provide the value should we want to, but we also have a flexible component. If you don't provide the value, that's cool. We'll just come up with a reasonable default, and we'll get the component rendered to the screen. That is it for that challenge. I'm going to go ahead and remove the comment right there, and back inside of the terminal, I'm going to switch things back to app.js. Up arrow key twice to load the command I ran 2 commands ago, and that should bring the application back inside of Chrome. The app is back, and that is it for this video. In the next one, we're going to explore how we can debug our React components, aside from just using things like the debugger and console.log. We're going to take a look at a dedicated tool for debugging React inside of Chrome. So let's go ahead and jump into that.